I want to welcome you to the March meeting of the Ohio State University Emeritus Academy. Before our talk today, I have a few brief business meeting items for you, and basically announcements for the spring quarter. But first, I want to note that the Executive Vice President Provost, Melissa Gilliam, is unable to join us today, which was the originally scheduled time. And she is now scheduled to join us on May 4th at our Emeritus Academy meeting. Also, I want you to note that invitations have been made for applications for new members with a deadline at the end of this week. And I encourage you all to talk to Emeritus colleagues of yours and have them apply. And second, there are calls for new members to the Emeritus Academy Steering Committee and for the Emeritus Academy lectures for next year, both of which are very important. And please nominate yourself or a fellow Academy professor for both of these two things, that is to become a steering committee member or to give a talk. And if you have any questions about giving a lecture or volunteering to be on the Emeritus Academy, please contact me directly. And my email is aush.1, which is up on on my picture somewhere, and it is also Jason is going to put it in the chat feature. And so just please contact me, and I'll be happy to discuss this with you. Also note that there will be an announcement coming out very soon. It's time to start to think about the 5-year renewals for being a member of the Emeritus Academy, and the due date of that will be at the end of March. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, if not, our next meeting will be on Wednesday, April 6th, and our speaker will be Academy Professor Bruce Kimball in the Department of Educational Studies, and he will speak on writing the history of the Harvard Law School, 1817 to 2020. And this promises to be another very interesting talk, and I hope you will all attend. During our talk today, please mute yourself. After our talk, I will attempt to monitor questions that can be asked either in person or in the chat feature of Zoom, whichever you prefer. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Richard Firth Green, who is an Academy Professor of English. Dr. Green received both his BA and MA from Oxford and his PhD from the University of Toronto. He's held faculty positions at several Canadian universities, including Mount Allison University, Bishop's University, University of British Columbia, and Western University in Ontario. Dr. Green assumed a position at Ohio State University in 2002 in the Department of English, and from 2006 to 2013, he served as the director of the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at Ohio State. Dr. Green has numerous publications, including books such as A Crisis of Truth, Literature and Law in the Ricardian England, Poets and Prince Pleasers, Literature and English Court in the Late Middle Ages, and an edited book which is titled Ballads of the North Medieval to Modern, Essays Inspired by Larry Singergaard. A couple of his more recent publications are book chapters that are titled A Poet at Work, John Grover's Revisions to the Tale of Rosaphili, and another one would be from Sir Egalar to Old Banham, Travels of a Ballad Hero. He has received numerous awards during his career, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, being president of the New Chaucer Society, and being a counselor for the Medieval Academy of America. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Richard Green, Academy Professor of the Department of English, whose presentation will be Fairy Tales and Tales about Fairies in the Middle Ages. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bill. I should just say that the book Ballads of the North was in part subsidized by the by the Emeritus Academy. So
Excellent.
I should put in that little plug. I and my fellow editor were very grateful for that. Let me just see if I can get up a slideshow so that we can see pictures as we go along. Then the pictures are not going to be vital, but they'll at least save you having to look at my face the whole time. Okay, are we ready? Can we start? Yeah. Okay, about the time I retired from OSU at the beginning of 2016, I was finishing up a book on fairies. You see the cover right there, in the Middle Ages. It seemed to me that this talk might provide a useful occasion for looking back on it and exploring some of the implications that I didn't talk about at the time. No one has been more surprised than me by its success. It's won 3 prizes, but the one I'm most pleased by, though perhaps not the most prestigious, was an Aslan for Myth and Fantasy Studies at the 2011 MythCon conference in Chicago. Alas, to my lasting regret, the prize, there we go. The prize, a plastic lion on a plinth with an engraved inscription, has a suspicious resemblance to the lions in Trafalgar Square, doesn't it? Has never actually reached me, despite several nudges from my side. Gold medals all to the good, but a plastic lion on a plinth now, that's something to leave the grandchildren. I only bring it up here because fantasy is actually a topic I mostly passed over in the book, and something I thought it might be interesting to think about with you this afternoon. First then, the book, why I wrote it and what it's about. Anyone who has read at all widely in the literature of the Middle Ages will know that fairies are a significant presence in medieval romances, generally as either lovers, as in Melusine, or as helpers, Oberon in Huon of Bordeaux, or both. In Marie de France's L'Enval, for instance, the hero has both a fairy mistress and a fairy servant to help him on his quest. Arthurian romance in particular swarms with fairies, such as King Arthur's half-sister Morgan le Fay, or Vivian, the Lady of the Lake. You'll notice that in neither case do these look like fairies, they look just like you and me. In fact, fairies in the Middle Ages, generally speaking, were indistinguishable from human beings. They weren't smaller. There are a couple examples of smaller fairies, but since they can shapeshift, they can be smaller if they want to be. But one thing they don't ever have is wings. That's a much later development, and they're certainly not sort of insect-like as they are in Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance. While reading some medieval exemplar, the moral tales collected by medieval preachers to spice up their sermons, I was struck by how often the devils and demons of these exemplar resemble fairies. Why, for instance, would a preacher talk about devils living in a castle in the woods, or devils feasting, or dancing, or hunting, or riding off to war? This sent me to an early 13th century theologian called William of Auvergne, Bishop of Paris, whose Encyclopedia de Universo contains a lengthy section on devils, many of whom he describes as behaving in ways that are strikingly similar to the activities of the fairies of romance and later folklore. 2 things became clear. Here was a source for popular belief about fairies that had been largely ignored by medievalists. And 2, the medieval church was deeply antagonistic to such popular beliefs, seeking literally to demonize fairies and to infernalize fairyland. That's a picture of the engendering of Merlin the magician. And it's quite clear from the early texts that Merlin's father was a fairy. His mother was mortal, but his father was a fairy. And in later texts, the father gets turned into a demon or a devil, and you can see there an illustration of Merlin's father with actual horns. Such antagonism, in my view, hardened in the later Middle Ages. The turning point is arguably Pope John XXII's bull Super Ilia Specula of 1326, becoming in effect a Kulturkampf, a culture war that contributed in no small measure to the horrific witch hunts of the European Renaissance. My research therefore took a historical turn. I started out with literature, but it became a historical quest. I found myself no longer primarily interested in fairies as literary phenomena, as plot devices or projections of male or female fantasy, for instance, but as the focus of actual contested belief in the real world. Let me state quite unequivocally here that I do not myself believe in fairies. Though even in the 21st century West, there are those, and not merely New Age pagans, that do. The only one, I went to the Fairy Investigation Society website, the only Ohio listing they have is a leprechaun that apparently robbed a convenience store. I don't think that's a terribly good example, but it's the best one I could find. They're most evident in Ireland, in Scandinavia, particularly Iceland, and in Newfoundland. Furthermore, as folklorists have pointed out, the widespread belief in aliens in North America, particularly in alien abduction, bears a strong resemblance to earlier fairy beliefs. A late 14th century English chronicle, for instance, tells the story of a solitary rider waylaid by a little red man and led against his will into the presence of a beautiful lady. She commands her attendants to remove his skin and take out his brains, as it seemed to him, says the chronicler. He's later, and of course, the resemblance to alien stories about sort of various kinds of investigation of the inner organs. He's later dumped, deprived of his wits, in a nearby village, and only restored to health, predictably, by the intervention of a saint, which is how we have the story. To the literal minded, such a story will be evidence that aliens have been visiting our planet for hundreds of years. A better known example might be the famous Green Children of Woolpit. I suspect it simply shows that we have a deep psychosocial need to feel that we're not alone on this planet. It's easy to poo-poo such marginal beliefs, whether in fairies or in aliens, but they seem to me worth taking seriously on their own terms. I'm convinced that in the Middle Ages, they performed a valuable social function, helping not only to explain for a small-scale pre-scientific communities sudden inexplicable changes of fortune, medical, financial, meteorological, agricultural, and the like. You know, if the weather turns nasty, it's the fairies, you know. But also to reconcile its members to potentially disruptive social challenges. Less troublesome to attribute an unexpected pregnancy to a fairy lover, for example, than to the supposedly celibate village priest. It's particularly clear for the belief in changelings. I'll just find you some changelings. That, if anyone's interested in medieval changelings, that is by far the best introduction, the story of the Holy Greyhound, as related by the French Annales historian Jean-Claude Schmitt. The movie, The Sorceress, is based on it. It's a terrific movie. It's easy for us to be shocked by the notion that a disabled child might be regarded as a fairy reject, secretly swapped for the family's healthy human baby. But if such an attitude might appear inhumane from one point of view, from another, it offered consolation to a grieving mother whose real child was imagined to be living on happily in fairyland. Moreover, applied to a subsistence society where even one useless mouth to feed might mean the difference between survival and starvation, our modern Western values might seem over-scrupulous. My main point here, of course, is that fairy beliefs were a real presence in the lives of medieval people, and the efforts on the part of the church to stamp them out offer eloquent evidence of this fact. Not that all members of the laity believed in fairies, just as not all members of the clerisy held that fairies were devils, but many did. In fact, antagonism to, and to a lesser extent skepticism about fairies are far easier to document than credulity, if only because most believers were non-literate, and even those who could write were hesitant to discuss their beliefs openly. A rare exception is the conclusion to Jean Darras' Melusine, a story of the first Count of Lusignan, who foolishly breaks his fairy bride's prohibition against seeing her naked in the bathtub. You can see why she doesn't want that. She apparently has a tail. I guess the tail only appears when she's in the bathtub. The rest of the time, he doesn't see anything except to take exception to. This is my modernization of the Middle English translation of the original French. Therefore, if I have written or shown anything that to some seems neither possible nor credible, I beseech them to pardon me. For I feel and understand from the authors of grammar and philosophy, and in the French original, William of Auvergne is mentioned, that they repute and hold this present history for a true chronicle and thing of the fairy. And whoever says the contrary, I say the secret judgments of God and his punishments are impossible to be understood or known by the humanity of man, for the intellect of human creatures is too crude to understand the spirit species, and may only comprehend what it is insofar as God will suffer them. For there are found in many histories fairies that have been married and have had many children, but how this may be, the human creature may not conceive. Just occasionally, we catch the faint echo of a popular voice. Early in her trial for heresy, for instance, Joan of Arc was questioned about her attendance at springtime village picnics held under a so-called fairy tree in the village. In an unguarded moment, and Joan is rarely unguarded for a peasant girl, she's extraordinarily adept at answering the inquisitors. But in an unguarded moment, Joan says that she's never seen a fairy as far as she knew. That phrase, as far as she knew, is really a giveaway. But that she'd heard that the mayor's wife, who happened to be her own godmother, had seen them under the tree. It'd be fascinating to hear more, but unfortunately the prosecution drops this line of questioning fairly early. In the mid-14th century, an English Dominican called John Bromyard reported that when he told his parishioners that charms to recover stolen goods were the work of the devil, they retorted that it was not done by the devil, but by the fair folk. Fairies are almost always referred to by euphemisms. You don't want to upset them by not being polite. So you call them the fair folk, or the ladies from beyond, or the good walkers, or the good folk, good people, and so on. We have not, they say, he says, they say, we have not learned such things from the devil, nor do we believe in him, but in the fair folk. It's the only expression of actual belief in the fairies that I know of from the Middle Ages, or reported expression. In what may be the earliest post-classical work of folklore, a 15th century French work called the Gospel of Distaffs, there we are, one old woman tells us that the way to keep fairies at bay is to wear your nightdress back to front. And another recommends eating a piece of bread while sitting on the john. The obscenia, defecation, urination, and so on is an old way of dealing with spirits, and that's widespread. But the bread is interesting because in Newfoundland, until fairly recently, if you were taking a journey by yourself in a remote part, you were advised to put a piece of bread in your pocket just in case there were fairies around. I'm not sure what it means, but the connection is sort of interesting. My work then, having taken a distinctly historicist turn, such literary discussion as I undertook in the book was restricted to two main areas, showing how a more detailed knowledge of medieval fairy beliefs might help us understand what was going on in medieval literary texts, and exploring the political implications of authors choosing to write against or within a regime of official disapproval, even repression. Jean Derain, the author of Melusine, had a very powerful patron in the person of Jean, Duc de Berry, brother of the King of France. He was the same Jean, Duc de Berry, who commissioned the famous illuminated manuscript, the Très Riche Heure, which I'm sure many of you know. It's one of the most handsome books from the late Middle Ages. That's a picture of March, I think. So he felt free to write about fairies and discuss their existence with impunity. And you might notice that up in the top corner there, there is actually over the tower with the red pinnacle, there is a dragon. That's Melusine. When Melusine was seen naked in the bathtub, she turned into a dragon and flew out of the window. Jean Darras says that to this day, he says, you can't, I'm afraid, to see it now because the castle of Lusignan has been demolished. But to this day, says Jean Darras, you could see the footprint on the windowsill where she flew away. So offering proof that this really did happen. Others were not so secure. One folio of this is something I discovered 2 days ago when I was just looking for pictures to illustrate this talk. I wish I'd found this earlier because I would have put it in the book. One folio of a finely illustrated prose Lancelot in the Bodleian Library shows the Queen of Sarastan out riding with a retinue that includes Morgan Le Fay and an enchantress called Sabile, who's presumably a fairy. Someone, clearly disturbed by the presence of these fairies, has carefully erased them from the image. It reminds me of a chronicle from Lucca in Italy, recording the ravages of the Black Death, where someone has done exactly the same thing to a pair of devils who are attacking the population with scythes. Others avoided criticism by exercising various forms of self-censorship. For instance, at the beginning of his wonderfully impassioned religious allegory, Piers Plowman, A Quest for Salvation, constructed of a series of dreams and written and rewritten at least 3 times over the course of his life, William Langland first describes how he fell asleep beside a stream. Me befell a fairly, of fairy me thochte, he says. Literally, a wonderful thing happened to me. It seemed to me a marvel. Fairy in late 14th century English has a general sense of a wonderful thing. The word fairy originally doesn't refer to a creature at all. It refers to fairy land. The word fée means fairy in French, and féerie is where the fae live, but it eventually comes in English to mean the actual creature. Anyway, he takes this line, a wonderful thing happened to me, it seemed to me a marvel, and in a later revision, evidently worried that the connotations of the word fairy might give people the wrong impression, he changed this to the far less evocative, me befell for to sleep of weariness of walked. I happened to fall asleep, tired out with walking. Others avoid the problem by disguising their fairies as the demigods of classical antiquity. That's Diana and her nymphs, but I'm quite sure that the original illuminator thought of them as fairies. Boccaccio, for instance, wrote a tragic fairy story called The Nymph of Fiesole, but denies that such classical nymphs owe anything to, quotation, to the silly young girls and ignorant rustics who report without blushing that they've seen the most beautiful women, whom they themselves call fairies, emerging from springs. Geoffrey Chaucer was clearly skeptical about the existence of fairies, and in the preface to his Wife of Bath's tale, he says that all the fairies are gone, that the friars have got rid of them. It's a very modern position. Max Weber argued that it was 16th century Protestant capitalism that finally expelled us from the great enchanted garden where people were obliged to revere or coerce the spirits. And though Weber was not so naive as to imagine that such expulsion did not have an extended prehistory, it's interesting to find that Chaucer attributes the expulsion to a very different cause. So much for the general thrust of the book I was finishing when I left Columbus in 2016. What I hadn't spent much time on was how my reimagining of the attitudes to fairy belief in the late Middle Ages might affect the way we actually respond to the fairies themselves when we encounter them in medieval romances. Now, it's plainly a quixotic enterprise for a quick 21st century readers to imagine that they might hope to read, say, Chaucer as if they were 14th century Londoners. The barriers to achieving such a goal are formidable. One, of course, is linguistic. After 50 years of reading Middle English, I still don't inhabit the language with anything like the facility that one of Chaucer's own servants would have done. Another is historical. I can master the large historical facts of the period, the Black Death, the Peasants' Revolt, the 100 Years' War, the politics of King Richard II's reign. I can read up on social history, levels of literacy, conditions of employment, the legal status of women. But without first-hand experience of social minutiae, the day-to-day gossip of the London streets, the hopes and fears of the people, even the tastes, smells and sounds of daily life, I can never hope to read Chaucer with the instinctive grasp of even the dullest member of his contemporary audience. But at one remove from such affective reading, there is something I think we can talk about with some hope of making sense, and that is genre. Indeed, in tandem with its formal aspects, genre might almost be regarded as the encapsulation of the affective responses of a particular reading, or in the case of Middle Ages, perhaps also listening community. And German reception theorists have stressed that genre is not a fixed, immutable thing, but something that changes with time and circumstance. In the case of the fairy story, our modern affective responses have been wholly conditioned by questions of credibility. The Oxford English Dictionary gives two definitions of fairy tale. The first, whose earliest citation is 1635, is a tale about fairies, a tale set in fairyland. But this sense has been watered down over time and has come to mean simply a tale having folkloric elements and featuring fantastic events or characters. In fact, such a tale need not have any actual fairies in it at all. Most people, for instance, would call Puss in Boots a fairy tale, but there are no fairies in it. The OED's second definition, dated only 36 years later, is something resembling a fairy tale in being unreal or incredible. Also a fabricated story, a lie. Unlike the first sense, this second one has retained its potency. And the OED quotes the Atlanta Journal and Constitution of 2011. There are rules to what can be admitted as evidence, and ridiculous fairy tales and lies are not allowed. The implausibility test has even penetrated academic discourse, so that most folklorists would regard fairy tales as the equivalent to German Märchen and accept the Grimm brothers' assertion that whereas Sagen, sagas if you like, are in some sense believable, Märchen are not. Thus, we've been conditioned by post-medieval attitudes to fairies to construe any story containing them as a purely imaginative construct, and we tend instinctively to project such conditioning back upon a medieval audience. I suggest that a 14th century Oxford English Dictionary, if we could imagine such a book, would actually have begun its definition of fairy tale with an unorthodox popular story about demons, an heretical belief. A recent book on fairies in medieval romance by a man called James Wade, there it is, begins with an appeal to possible worlds theory. Fairies, the author writes, belong to a world distinct from the worlds of ordinary humanity and orthodox theology, and on account of these supernatural origins, they are free not only from the physical laws of normal time and space, but also from the standard laws of logic and from the modern moral strictures of ordinary human interaction. It was the creative potential of such qualities, he argues, that inspired the authors of medieval romance. Now, while this may be true of a modern fairy fiction, like Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, it's a wonderful book, in which a recognizable early 19th century England is strangely distorted by the presence of fairies and their influence on current events, such as the Battle of Waterloo, I'm far less sure that it works for the later Middle Ages. Of course, the modern reader is perfectly at liberty to read L'Enval as if Marie de France was simply a Susanna Clarke in a funny old costume. And I suspect that's how most people do read L'Enval, if they read L'Enval at all. But for the historicist, that can never be enough. Now, I certainly would not want to suggest that medieval people were unable to accept the notion of possible worlds. A major strand of medieval philosophy, associated particularly with William of Ockham, drew a distinction between God's two powers, his absolute power to create any world he might choose, and his ordained power confined to the one he's actually chosen. Later nominalists seem to have been divided over the question of whether the laws of nature are to be fully equated with God's ordained power, whether, for instance, a saint's miracles are preordained, or instances of God exercising his absolute power. But either way, the scope for devising alternate worlds, distinct from the worlds of ordinary humanity and orthodox theology, was severely circumscribed. On the one hand, if, like Carlo Ginzburg's Miller of Friuli, you made a serious attempt to articulate your own universe, you risked being accused of mimicking God's absolute power and incurring the suspicion of heresy. And in fact, the Miller, Minocchio he was called, was actually a poor man burnt at the stake. On the other, since it's clear that even for a proto-empiricist like Albert the Great, God's ordained world contained phenomena far beyond our ken, no apparently imaginary creature, even the Far Eastern monopods and dog-headed men of travelers' tales, could ever be dismissed out of hand. As the author of Melusine puts it, the intellect of human creatures is too crude to understand the spirit species and may only comprehend what it is insofar as God will suffer them. Under such circumstances, was it even possible to create a non-ordained world? And if not, what of the genre we call fantasy? Must we then accept Jacques Le Goff, the great French historian, Jacques Le Goff's confident assertion that in the medieval period, there was no fantastic? Francophone scholarship has been very much more diligent than its Anglophone counterpart when it comes to illuminating the genre of the fantastic. And I found the structuralist Tzvetan Todorov particularly helpful. Before turning to his 1970 introduction to the literary fantastic, however, a couple of caveats are necessary. The genre of the fantastic, as Todorov understands it, is both narrower in scope and darker in character than the fantasy genre familiar to most Anglophone readers, closer in fact to what we might regard as horror than fantasy. I suspect this is true for French readers in general, since Roger Caillois's Anthologie du Fantastique includes translations of such English works as Dickens's The Signalman, W.W. Jacobs' The Monkey's Paw, M.R. James's Lost Hearts, T.H. Lawrence's Rocking Horse Winner, and from the States, Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, and Henry James's The Friends of the Friends, all of these either horror stories or ghost stories. There's nothing remotely resembling such stock Anglophone examples of fantasy as Alice in Wonderland, or The Once and Future King, or The Last Unicorn. Indeed, for Caillois, the dominant emotion evoked by the fantastic is terror. He sees the fantastic as lying somewhere between the fairy tale on the one side and science fiction on the other. And while all three are genres in which the imagination is allowed free play, the first is distinguished from fantasy by its magical thinking, the last by its empiricism. Caillois also suggests that these three forms have developed one from the other in a historical sequence. Todorov takes issue with Caillois' analysis, but both of them share a similarly dark view of the fantastic. And while we might suppose that this makes Todorov an unhelpful guide when it comes to medieval fairy tales, as we shall see, that's not necessarily the case. My second caveat concerns the English translation of the fantastic. Todorov was a structuralist. He recognizes the category that Freud terms the unheimlich, in French, l'étrange, but he cannot accept Freud's explanation for it. He cannot believe, he says, that literature veut dire autre chose qu'elle-même. In other words, literature means only itself. It's not, for Todorov, a key to the unconscious. It seems to me, therefore, perverse of the English translator of L'Introduction à la littérature fantastique to render l'étrange throughout as the uncanny, a term that for English readers has an unmistakable Freudian overtone. In actual fact, the term uncanny, as it's usually understood in English, comes close to describing the quality that Todorov discerns in the fantastic. Yet he explicitly contrasts l'étrange with the fantastic. For me, this makes the translation in places barely coherent. In fact, I started, and we were all lazy and we read the translation. I started reading the translation. I couldn't make head or tails of it, and I had to turn to the French to try and work out what's going on. At the risk of oversimplifying Todorov's subtle analysis, then, I shall render his l'étrange here as the outlandish rather than the uncanny. According to Todorov, there he is. I hope he approves of what I'm going to say. According to Todorov, the fantastic is an evanescent genre, occupying a shifting, unstable territory between le merveilleux, the marvelous on the one hand, and l'étrange, the outlandish on the other. Or rather more pragmatically, between the experience of le surnaturel accepté, the supernatural accepted, and le surnaturel expliqué, the supernatural explained. The fantastic then lies somewhere, sorry, I just changed 2 pages here, somewhere between the supernatural event we are happy to collude with, however marvelous, and the supernatural event we can find an explanation for, however outlandish. Readers of fantasy are kept in a constant state of hesitation unless or until they're able to account for its fantastic elements, in which case it becomes merely outlandish, or meet them on their own terms, in which case it'll be simply marvelous. The litmus paper in this experiment is always the degree to which the events of the story appear to conform or can be made to conform to the reader's own experience of the world. In other words, the fantastic text, and this is a quotation, it's my translation of quotation, obliges its reader to consider the world of its characters as a world of living human beings, and to vacillate between a natural and a supernatural explanation of the events related. It follows then that from the perspective of their enchanted garden, medieval readers and listeners would have been more prepared to find the supernatural acceptable and explicable than we do. And this might seem to have left them very little room for the true fantastic. Indeed, Todorov himself, in a rare foray from the synchronic into the diachronic, suggests that the literary fantastic enjoyed only a comparatively brief flowering from the end of the 18th century to the end of the 19th. Todorov's categories can be made to map fairly well onto the standard medieval taxonomy of what we would think of as the supernatural. There's the book on the supernatural I put up a little earlier. Though confusingly, what he would term the marvelous, the supernatural accepted, was called in the Middle Ages the miraculous, whereas the outlandish, the supernatural explained, belonged to the medieval category of the marvelous. It's merely a terminological confusion, I think. From this perspective, it's clear that fairies, whether categorized as demons or as exotic creatures, were simply outlandish, and thus that stories about them could not be regarded as literary fantasy. But this neat paradigm is complicated by Todorov's requirement that we attempt to measure the fantastic against our experience of the world around us. But it's clear from Geoffrey Chaucer's skepticism, amongst others, that by the late 14th century, Weberian disenchantment was already beginning to eat away at the credibility of the fairy world. In the early 13th century, Huon of Bordeaux's Oberon is plainly outlandish rather than fantastic. But can we say the same of Jean Daras's Melusine, which was written during Chaucer's lifetime? Calois, no doubt thinking of Madame d'Aulnoy and Charles Perrault, says that one characteristic of the fairy tale is its happy ending. But there's nothing particularly happy about the ending of Melusine. When she flies out of a window, she leaves behind her an ambiguous legacy. Not all of her 10 children go on to found celebrated dynasties, though several of them do. One is appropriately named Horrible, and another, Buck-toothed Geoffrey of the big tooth, literally, sets fire to the abbey where his brother Fromond is a monk and burns them all to death. Nor is the subsequent history of the great Lusignan family untroubled. 3 days after Melusine appeared to him in 1369, people believed, King Peter I of Cyprus, who was an offshoot of the Lusignan, was murdered in his bed. There's a picture of him being murdered. Among the many stories connected with Melusine, one in particular conveys the sense of foreboding she evoked. It was believed that she would appear on the ramparts of Lusignan whenever control of the fortress was about to change hands. And in the summer and fall of 1376, Lusignan, the last remaining major English stronghold in Poitou, this is the first phase of the 100 Years' War that we're talking about here, was under siege by the forces of Jean, Duc de Berry. Jean Daras says that he had learned from the Duke himself that John Cresswell, the English castellan who was defending the castle, and he's a perfectly well-attested historical figure, Cresswell, had been visited by Melusine 3 days before its surrender. At the time, he was in bed. This is not actually a picture of him, but still, it'll do. He was in bed with a woman called Alexandrine, and he was never in his days so afeared, says Jean Derain. Cresswell, a grizzled old campaigner from the first phase of the 100 Years' War, was certainly not a man to be easily frightened, a fact not lost on his sarcastic bedfellow. And I love this quotation. I'll read it in its original, not in its original accent, but "Ha, valiant Sassuel, how oft have I seen your mortal enemies before your presence that never ye were affared. And now, for a serpent of feminine nature, ye shake for fear." I must say, I think that the serpent, the dragon actually comes down the chimney when it's in bed. It seems to me that, you know, if you're in your pajamas, whether the dragon is male or female would hardly matter. But anyway, the analogous genre here is obviously the ghost story. It's surely no accident that the words fantasy and phantom have the same root, nor that a number of Todorov's examples are taken from ghost stories written in a period when popular belief in ghosts was beginning to wane. Surely it's this increasing uncertainty which drives Todorov's central observation that the fantastic occupies a shifting, unstable territory between the marvelous and the outlandish, a territory where belief is constantly being put to the test. The point I should like to leave you with is the suggestion that for audiences in the late Middle Ages, fairy stories, or better, stories about fairies, produce the same frisson that ghost stories were to do later, and for the same reason. Listeners unwilling quite to accept the existence of fairies, but at the same time unable quite to dismiss them. As many people even in our own day would say, I don't believe in ghosts, but. Some modern writers, Susanna Clarke in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, for example, are prepared to suffuse their fairy worlds with an air of dark menace, but without the niggling suspicion that fairies might be real on the part of their readers, they can never convey a sense of the fantastic as Todorov defines it. In Ireland, 150 years ago, however, that suspicion evidently remained potent. Arguably, it still does. And I would like to finish by reading you, yeah, we have time, by reading you the end of a fairy story published in 1875 and set in Limerick. It was written by Sheridan Le Fanu, a writer better known for his ghost stories, and it's called The Child That Went with the Fairies. In order to put it in context, let me tell you what happened to Bridget Cleary 20 years later in the county of Tipperary, which is next door to Limerick. Bridget, the wife of an illiterate labourer named Michael Cleary, fell ill. And when the local doctor was unable to help, her husband appeared to the village cunning man, or fairy doctor, as he was known. He told Michael Cleary that the sick woman was really a changeling and that his real wife had been taken by the fairies, that he must hold Bridget over a fire to force them to return her to him. Michael did this in the presence of a room full of people, including his in-laws, and Bridget was burned to death. The case was reported in detail because Michael attempted to conceal the body and was charged with murder. It's by far the best known of these cases, but it's probably not the only one. The Child That Went with the Fairies concerns a poor widow called Molly Ryan with 4 children, an older daughter and 3 young children, 2 boys and a girl. One day, when the mother has gone to fetch turf for the fire, the 3 younger children are playing on the road outside their lonely cottage. I'll abridge a little bit of this and then I'll read the last 2 or 3 pages. Suddenly, a startling voice with a screech called to them from behind, ordering them to get out of the way. And turning, they saw a sight such as they'd never beheld before. It was a carriage drawn by 4 horses that were pawing and snorting in impatience as it just pulled up. The children were almost under their feet and scrambled to the side of the road next to their own door. The carriage and all its appointments were old-fashioned and gorgeous and presented to the children, who had never seen anything finer than a turf car and once an old chaise that passed that way from Killaloe, a spectacle perfectly dazzling. The children were so frightened that they could only gape and turn white in their panic. But a very sweet voice from the open window of the carriage reassured them and arrested the attack of the lackey. A beautiful and very grand-looking lady was smiling from it on them, and they all felt pleased in the strange light of that smile. "The boy with the golden hair, I think," said the lady, bending her large and wonderfully clear eyes on little Billy. And her voice sounded sweet as a silver bell in the children's ears, and her smile beguiled them like the light of an enchanted lamp as she leaned from the window with a look of ineffable fondness on the golden-haired boy with the large blue eyes, insomuch that little Billy, looking up, smiled in return with a wondering fondness, and when she stooped down and stretched her bejeweled arms towards him, he stretched his little hands up, and how they touched the other children did not know. But saying, "Come and give me a kiss, my darling," she raised him, and he seemed to ascend in her small fingers as lightly as a feather, and she held him in her lap and covered him with kisses. And then the carriage rolls away and she throws apples out of the windows, and the children are distracted. They don't see what happens to it, and they return to their mother without their little brother. Molly Ryan never more saw her darling, but something of the lost little boy was seen by his former playmates. Sometimes when their mother was away earning a trifle at haymaking, and Nellie washing the potatoes for their dinner, or beetling the clothes in the little stream that flows in the hollow close by, they saw the pretty face of little Billy peeping in archly at the door and smiling silently at them. And as they ran to embrace him with cries of delight, he drew back, still smiling archly. And when they got into the open day, he was gone, and they could see no trace of him anywhere. This happened often, with slight variations in the circumstances of the visit. Sometimes he would peep for a longer time, sometimes for a shorter time. Sometimes his little hand would come in and with bended finger beckon them to follow. But always he was smiling with the same arch look and wary silence, and always he was gone when they reached the door. Gradually, these visits grew less and less frequent, and in about 8 months, they ceased altogether, and little Billy, irretrievably lost, took rank in their memories with the dead. One wintry morning, nearly a year and a half after his disappearance, their mother having set out for Limerick soon after cockcrow to sell some fowls in the market, the little girl lying by the side of her elder sister, who was fast asleep, just at the grey of the morning, heard the latch lifted softly and saw little Billy enter and close the door gently after him. There was light enough to see that he was barefoot and ragged, looked pale and famished. He went straight to the fire and cowered over the turf embers and rubbed his hands slowly and seemed to shiver as he gathered the smouldering turf together. The little girl clutched her sister in terror and whispered, "Waken, Nellie, waken, it's Billy come back." Nellie slept soundly on, but the little boy, whose hands were extended close over the coals, turned and looked towards the bed, and it seemed to her in fear, and she saw the glare of the embers reflected on his thin cheek as he turned towards her. He rose and went on tiptoe quickly to the door in silence, let himself out as softly as he'd come in, and after that the little boy was never seen any more by any one of his kindred. Fairy doctors, as the dealers in the preternatural, who in such cases were called in, are termed, did all that in them lay, but in vain. Father Tom came down and tried what holier rites could do, but equally without result. So little Billy was dead to mother, brother, and sisters, but no grave received him. Others whom affection cherished lay in holy ground, in the old churchyard of Abington, with headstone to mark the spot over which the survivor might kneel and say a kind prayer for the peace of the departed soul. But there was no landmark to show where little Billy was hidden from their loving eyes, unless it was the old hill of Lisnavura that cast its long shadow at sunset before the cabin door. or that white and filmy in the moonlight in later years would occupy his brother's gaze as he returned from fair or market, and drew from him a sigh and a prayer for the little brother he had lost so long ago and was never to see again. Of course, many of its other generic markers are quite distinct, but I hope the little Billy's story has conveyed something of the gulf between the way stories like Melusine were received by their original audience and the fairy tales we take them for today. Thank you.
Richard, thank you very much. That was fascinating talk. We have time for a few questions, and so if anybody would like to ask a question, again, either indicate that you want to talk by talking right on the Zoom, or write a question on the chat feature.
Can I get rid of the PowerPoint now? Is that possible?
Yes, you can do that.
There we go. Good. I've done it.
Good.
Wow. Excellent. Good. Right.
When and how did fairies acquire their wings? That's Mark Bard.
That's an interesting question. I don't know of any example before Shakespeare, and in Shakespeare they have wings. It's not quite clear where. After Shakespeare, of course, the wings everywhere. There's a fascinating man called Simon Young, who teaches in Italy, who runs the Fairy Investigation Society website, and he's actually written an article on fairy wings and where, and I think more where when they first occur than where they come from, but still, it's possibly some kind of classical borrowing. I don't know, but it's very strange. Where Shakespeare is really a popularizer of fairy beliefs and fairy motifs, but where he gets them from is not clear. There are a couple of Elizabethan sources that he may have used, but he's he's working from popular belief as well. But the other thing is the small fairies. I mean, nothing in the Middle Ages to indicate that fairies are sort of the size of your thumb. There are a couple of dwarf fairies, but no tiny insect-like fairies at all. I see that question about witches. Yeah, that is a fascinating question, actually, because the very first performance of Macbeth was witnessed by a strange sort of occult doctor, I don't know, anyway, who left a man called Foreman, who left a diary and his account of seeing plays, including Macbeth, and he calls the witches in Macbeth fairies. He saw on that stage fairies, and it's quite clear that in the popular imagination, fairies and witches were easily confused. I mean, it seems strange to us, where fairies belong to one kind of species and witches to another. But it's quite clear that one reason is that witches, male or female, cunning folk, wise men, wise women, made use of fairies. They appealed to fairies to work their own cures, or they claimed to be able to heal people of illnesses that fairies had caused. So it's easy to see, I suppose, why people would confuse the two, but it still seems a very strange category confusion to us. There's a very interesting book by Ginsberg called the Benandante, the Night Walkers, and he calls them witches, but it's quite clear if you read the accounts, the witchcraft trial that it's based on, that some people thought of them not as witches at all, but as fairies. So it's very interesting, this kind of confusion between the two groups. And it's certainly true, I think, that fairy beliefs were some of the things that were being persecuted in the appalling witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. This is very clear in Scotland. The Scottish witch trials, of which we have some very good accounts, they're frequently referring to fairies, the accused. Does that help?
Yeah, Mark DeBard has a follow-up question. Do fairies and the fantastic have parallels elsewhere in the world besides Europe?
Oh yeah, they're all over the place. I think almost every community has its sort of strange humanoid spirits that surround it in some way. You find them in Africa, you find them in the Far East. Japan has a very rich tradition of what, for better or worse, we call fairy stories. Of these kinds of spirits that are living on the edge of the human life world. Yeah, I think it's almost universal. I mean, it may actually. I'm not an anthropologist. I wouldn't want to say that it is universal, but it's very common.
Morris, I think you have a question next.
Yes, Richard, this is terrific. But I wonder, do you want to comment at all about Conan Doyle and the so-called photographs
yes.
he claimed were true photographs of fairies?
Yeah, I mean that is really the Cottingley fairies. Yeah, it's a fascinating story because we think of Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes as the ultimate rationalist. Of course, he was interested in the occult and in mediums and visitations of the dead and so on. I mean, he did have that side to him, but he was completely, for people who, Morris and I obviously know this stuff, but for people who don't know, there were a couple of little girls in Yorkshire who messed around with their father's camera and little paper cutouts of fairy figures, and they photographed themselves in the garden with fairies. It was really quite for two little girls, it was really quite advanced piece of photographic manipulation, I think. But it took in a whole lot of people, including Conan Doyle. And Conan Doyle said, here is our proof, there really are fairies. And one of the little girls went to her death not admitting that it was fake. The other one, I think, did. They were cousins. I don't think they were sisters. They were cousins. One did admit that finally that it was a fake, but one never did. One went to her death saying it was true. But it's a great story. Yeah. Thanks for bringing it up.
Okay, Maya Dowring has a question. Why do you think fairies have an overwhelming female representation?
Well, yeah, that's also interesting. I mean, I can speak particularly of the Middle Ages. It would be true, I think, particularly as time goes on, that fairy queens are much more significant presence than fairy kings. Fairy kings do exist. Oberon is a fairy king, and Oberon doesn't have a wife. He's unusual in that respect. Where you have a couple, often the wife is the stronger or the more important figure, and sometimes you don't have a couple at all. It's just a fairy queen without a consort. How we explain that is another question. It may partly be that fairy beliefs were preserved in an oral tradition, and that women were particularly tradition bearers of traditional tales. The clerical disapproval of fairies in the Middle Ages, people like William of Auvergne, for instance, are constantly talking about these old women, these ignorant old women who tell these stories about fairies. And I suppose if the stories are preserved primarily by women, then they are going to preserve stories about fairy queens rather than fairy kings. But there's no question that it is gendered. The fairy stories are not exclusively female in orientation, but largely so. And in later, certainly by the time of the Renaissance, fairies become a kind of sexual fantasy. There are actually sort of spells for conjuring up sexy fairy queens and things. You know, it's extraordinary. That's later. That's not medieval that I know of, but and they would just be fed that the sources don't survive. I don't know, but yeah, I don't have a complete answer for that. But the fact is absolutely absolutely the case that fairies are gendered female largely.
Interesting. Are there any other questions? Well, seeing how we've basically run through the time that we have allotted and there are no more questions, I would like to thank Richard very much for a fascinating talk. Something that we could probably ask questions on for another couple hours. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
And we'll look forward to seeing you all at our next Emeritus Academy meeting. Thank you for attending.